This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Lucas and Ryan weren't brothers by blood, but after their parents married, their lives became intertwined in ways neither of them had expected. Lucas, who had always been a magnetic personality, took easily to his new role as the older stepbrother. Outgoing and confident, he thrived in social situations, exuding a warmth that drew people in. He had an ease about him, moving through life with the assurance of someone who knew exactly where he fit in the world. His friends admired him, teachers praised him, and in his social circles, Lucas was undeniably a leader. Ryan, on the other hand, was his opposite. Quiet and introverted, he had always been more comfortable on the fringes of social interactions, preferring the company of a good book or a solo afternoon at the park over the crowds and noise that Lucas relished. Ryan was the kind of person who blended into the background, his shyness often misinterpreted as aloofness. Where Lucas radiated confidence, Ryan exuded hesitancy, and this difference initially made their sudden brotherhood seem like it might be strained or awkward. But something unexpected happened between them. From the first day their families moved into the same house, they fell into an easy rhythm. Lucas, with his open-hearted approach to life, took the lead in welcoming Ryan into his world. At school, he introduced him to his friends, made sure Ryan never sat alone at lunch, and took him under his wing in social situations where Ryan would have otherwise faded into the background. Ryan, who was used to being the quiet observer, found himself gradually opening up around Lucas. In Lucas's company, he felt less self-conscious, more secure, as if his stepbrother's confidence could somehow extend to him, and their bond grew rapidly. On the surface, it was the kind of relationship that everyone admired. They were always together, whether it was playing sports in the neighborhood park, biking around town, or simply watching movies at home late into the night. Family and friends saw them as inseparable, two stepbrothers who had seamlessly blended their lives together as if they had been born into the same family. It was the perfect picture of what a blended family should look like, two boys who were figuring out how to become brothers, despite the fact that they came from different pasts. Yet beneath the surface, there was more. For Ryan, the ease with which Lucas pulled him into his world felt strange at times. He had never had anyone like Lucas in his life before, someone who was both a guide and a protector. Ryan, who had always been more introverted, found comfort in Lucas's presence, as though Lucas was a shield against the parts of life that had always intimidated him. When they were at school, Lucas would make sure Ryan wasn't alone, and when they were with friends, Lucas's outgoing nature seemed to cover for Ryan's quietness. In many ways, Ryan began to depend on Lucas, not just as a stepbrother, but as someone who made life easier to navigate. For Lucas, there was something equally unique about Ryan. Despite their differences, Lucas found himself drawn to his new stepbrother's quiet nature. Ryan was the calm in the storm of his otherwise busy, socially driven life. While Lucas enjoyed being the center of attention, he also appreciated the silence he could share with Ryan. He didn't need to fill every moment with conversation or activity when they were together. They could sit for hours watching movies, sometimes without saying a word, and yet Lucas never felt bored or restless. In Ryan, he found a companion who, though different from him in so many ways, completed him in others. The two boys fell into a routine that seemed natural on the outside, but to them, it was anything but ordinary. At home, they were nearly inseparable. Their late-night movie sessions became a regular occurrence, where they would stay up until the early hours of the morning, sprawled out on the living room couch, watching action films or playing video games until they could barely keep their eyes open. Sometimes they would fall asleep right there, Lucas's arm draped casually over Ryan's shoulder, their bodies relaxed in a way that only deep familiarity could bring. To anyone else, it would have seemed like the innocent closeness of two brothers who had grown to care for each other. However, as the months passed, the bond between them deepened into something that neither of them fully understood. Lucas had always been protective of Ryan, looking out for him at school and in social settings, where Ryan's reserved nature sometimes made him a target for teasing. There was a quiet tension that had begun to simmer between them, a feeling that neither of them could quite name, but that lingered in the air during their long, quiet moments together. Ryan, who had never been good at handling emotions, found himself increasingly confused by the way he felt around Lucas. The casual touches, the shared space, the quiet nights watching movies, what had once felt like natural affection between brothers started to feel different. For Lucas, there was no questioning the closeness. He liked having Ryan around, liked the way they had grown so quickly from strangers to inseparable brothers. But something had begun to change for him, too. He found himself paying closer attention to Ryan than before, little things, like the way Ryan's hair fell across his forehead when he was lost in thought, or the way his eyes seemed to linger just a second too long when they looked at each other. There was a comfort in being with Ryan that Lucas couldn't explain, but there was also something else, something that felt just a little off-center, as though the line between brotherhood and something deeper was starting to blur. Despite this growing tension, they continued to spend more and more time together. At school, Lucas remained Ryan's protector, always there to defend him or step in when someone tried to make fun of his quietness. At home, they were a united front, helping their parents with chores, playing basketball in the driveway, or simply lying on the couch, side by side. Their parents saw their bond as a triumph of blended families, and their friends saw them as an unbreakable pair. No one suspected that there was more lurking beneath the surface, not even the boys themselves at first. The transition from being strangers to brothers had been seamless on the outside, but inside, both Lucas and Ryan were starting to feel the strain of emotions they couldn't quite put into words. What had started as a close brotherly connection now carried with it an undercurrent of tension that neither of them knew how to address. It was subtle at first, their lingering touches, the way their eyes sometimes met and stayed locked for just a little too long, but the feeling was undeniable. Both of them sensed it, but neither knew how to confront it, and so they kept it hidden, even from themselves. Lucas continued to act as though everything was normal, throwing his arm casually over Ryan's shoulders as they sat on the couch, joking with him, protecting him at school. Ryan continued to rely on Lucas's strength, his confidence, and the sense of safety he provided. But under the surface there was a quiet storm building, an unspoken tension that neither of them could ignore for much longer. In those silent moments, when the house was still and it was just the two of them, they felt it most acutely, the growing awareness that their bond had become something more complicated, something that defied easy explanation. And as the days passed, they both knew that the closeness they shared could not stay innocent forever. The line between stepbrothers and something far more dangerous had already begun to blur, and soon, they would be forced to confront the truth of what they had become to each other. As time passed, the bond between Lucas and Ryan deepened, but so did the complexity of their relationship. What had once been a natural closeness, defined by shared experiences and a developing brotherhood, began to shift into something both of them struggled to comprehend. The subtle touches and lingering glances that had once felt innocent now carried a weight neither could ignore. A tension lingered between them, heavy and thick, though it remained unspoken. They both sensed that something was changing, something dangerous, but neither of them dared to name it. Ryan was the first to truly feel the discomfort creeping into their interactions. He had always been the more introspective one, spending time alone with his thoughts, dissecting his feelings in ways Lucas never did. Ryan had grown used to the quiet comfort Lucas provided, a buffer from the world's chaos and a shield against his own insecurities. Lucas had become his constant, his protector, and his friend. But now Ryan found himself second-guessing everything, questioning the very foundation of their bond. The familiar gestures that had once been a source of reassurance, a hand on the shoulder, an arm draped casually around him, now made Ryan feel uneasy. The physical closeness that had once felt like a natural part of their stepbrotherhood began to blur into something far more complex. At first, Ryan tried to dismiss his feelings, chalking them up to a natural awkwardness that sometimes came with being a teenager. But there was something deeper, a discomfort that settled into his bones every time he was alone with Lucas. His heart would race when Lucas touched him, and his skin tingled under the weight of his stepbrother's gaze. He noticed the way Lucas's eyes lingered on him just a second too long, or how Lucas seemed to find excuses to be close to him in ways that felt different now. What had once been a reassuring, protective presence now made Ryan feel exposed. The unease gnawed at Ryan, growing stronger each day. He began avoiding the small moments of intimacy that had once been so natural between them. He started sitting on the opposite end of the couch when they watched movies, finding reasons to be out of the house more often, or retreating to his room under the guise of homework. Ryan hoped the distance would allow him to make sense of the growing tension, to regain control over emotions that felt increasingly out of his grasp. But no matter how much space he tried to put between them, Lucas's presence seemed inescapable. Lucas, on the other hand, didn't appear to notice the change in Ryan, or if he did, he didn't acknowledge it. For Lucas, the bond they shared felt as natural as ever, perhaps even stronger. He enjoyed the closeness they had developed, the ease with which they spent time together. Yet, like Ryan, Lucas began to feel something shift between them. It wasn't a single moment or action, but rather a slow accumulation of changes that became undeniable. He began noticing Ryan in ways he hadn't before, small details, like the way his hair fell across his forehead when he was deep in thought, or the quiet concentration on his face when he worked at his desk. Lucas wasn't one for self-reflection, not in the way Ryan was. He lived in the moment, confident and unbothered by the weight of emotions that often plagued his quieter stepbrother. But now, he found himself drawn to Ryan in ways he couldn't explain. There was a magnetic pull between them that felt stronger than before, an invisible thread that seemed to tighten every time they were alone. Lucas started to notice his own reactions to Ryan, the way his heart sped up when they made eye contact, or how he felt a strange comfort in the silence they shared late at night. He didn't understand it, but he didn't shy away from it either. In his mind, Lucas couldn't see anything wrong with the closeness they shared. He had always looked out for Ryan, always been protective of him. They were stepbrothers, but they were also best friends, and to Lucas, their connection made sense. He didn't question the extra time they spent together, or the small moments of physical affection that lingered longer than they used to. For Lucas, it was all part of the natural progression of their relationship, a bond that had grown deeper with time. But Ryan was drowning under the weight of that bond. The more Lucas leaned into their closeness, the more Ryan felt like he was losing control. He couldn't reconcile the way his heart fluttered when Lucas touched him with the guilt that immediately followed. His mind was in constant turmoil, fighting between the familiarity of brotherly affection and the confusing, almost terrifying, emotions that came with it. He knew that what he was feeling wasn't normal, at least. It wasn't what stepbrothers were supposed to feel for each other. He had tried, desperately, to convince himself that it was all in his head, that these feelings would pass if he ignored them long enough. But the tension wouldn't go away. It followed Ryan in every quiet moment they shared, creeping in during the late-night movie sessions or the long car rides where neither of them spoke, but the air felt heavy with unspoken words. The lines between them had begun to blur, and Ryan was terrified of what that meant. He couldn't look at Lucas without feeling the weight of his own confusion, a mix of guilt, fear, and something else, something he didn't want to admit to himself. It was becoming harder and harder to separate his emotions, and with each passing day, the internal struggle grew more intense. Lucas, meanwhile, continued to act as though everything was normal. He didn't understand Ryan's growing distance or the subtle changes in his behavior. When Ryan started to pull away, Lucas responded by pushing closer, trying to maintain the bond they had built. He found himself seeking out moments of connection, whether it was through playful teasing or quiet conversations. He noticed Ryan's hesitation, but in Lucas's mind, there was nothing to fear. The connection between them felt too strong to be broken by a little awkwardness or uncertainty. For Ryan, however, the struggle was becoming unbearable. He was suffocating under the weight of his emotions, unable to escape the confusing feelings that had taken root. He began to fear Lucas's presence, not because Lucas had done anything wrong, but because Ryan could no longer trust his own reactions. He found himself avoiding the quiet moments they used to share, retreating to his room when Lucas wanted to hang out, and making excuses to leave the house whenever he could. Ryan hoped that by distancing himself, he could regain some sense of normalcy, but all it did was heighten the tension between them. The more Ryan pulled away, the more confused Lucas became. He didn't understand why Ryan was acting so distant, why their once easygoing relationship had suddenly become strained. Lucas tried to brush it off, telling himself that it was just a phase, that Ryan was going through something that he would eventually get over. But deep down, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Lucas's attempts to bridge the gap only made things worse. He started to notice the way Ryan flinched when he touched him or how he avoided eye contact during their conversations. The once comforting silences between them were now filled with a thick tension that neither of them could ignore. Lucas's frustration grew with each passing day, his confusion turning into a quiet sense of dread. He couldn't understand why Ryan was pulling away, and it began to gnaw at him in ways he wasn't used to. Lucas had always been the confident one, the one who could fix any problem, but now he found himself helpless in the face of Ryan's withdrawal. For Ryan, the internal battle had reached its peak. He couldn't escape the feelings that had taken over his thoughts, and no matter how much he tried to distance himself, he couldn't get away from Lucas. The tension between them hung in the air like a storm waiting to break, and Ryan felt trapped, unable to move forward or backward. He had tried to suppress his emotions, to tell himself that this wasn't real, that these feelings would fade, but they hadn't. They had only grown stronger, and now Ryan didn't know what to do. The struggle between them, though silent and unspoken, was becoming unbearable. Both boys felt the tension, but neither could find the words to address it. For Lucas, the confusion was palpable. He couldn't understand why Ryan was acting the way he was, but he knew something had shifted. For Ryan, the struggle was internal, a fight against emotions he didn't want to acknowledge. He felt guilty for the way he reacted to Lucas's presence, guilty for the thoughts that plagued him late at night, and terrified of what it all meant. And yet, despite everything, they couldn't fully pull away from each other. The bond between them, though strained, remained. They were still stepbrothers, still bound by the same house, the same family, and the same memories. But the innocence of their relationship was gone, replaced by a quiet, suffocating tension that neither of them knew how to handle. Ryan struggled to suppress his feelings, and Lucas's confusion over Ryan's behavior had created a rift between them that threatened to tear them apart. But for now, they continued to navigate the storm in silence, both of them silently battling the emotions they were too afraid to confront. As the tension between Lucas and Ryan deepened, Lucas's feelings began to shift from simple affection to something much darker, an obsession he couldn't control. What had once been a close bond between stepbrothers now consumed him, taking over his every thought and action. Lucas, who had always been confident and carefree, found himself increasingly fixated on Ryan. His emotions, which had started as protective and brotherly, became overwhelming, laced with desire and possessiveness. He could no longer separate the feelings of love he once had for Ryan as a brother from the intense need to be with him, to keep him close at all costs. Ryan's growing distance only fueled this obsession. Lucas couldn't understand why Ryan had pulled away from him, why their relationship had become strained when it used to feel so natural. Every time Ryan avoided his touch or retreated into silence, it was like a physical blow to Lucas. The more Ryan distanced himself, the more Lucas wanted to close the gap, to bring things back to the way they had been before. But deep down, he knew that wasn't possible. Something had changed irrevocably between them, and Lucas was desperate to regain control. Lucas began to watch Ryan more closely, noticing every small detail, every little gesture that seemed to signal Ryan's withdrawal. He became hyper-aware of Ryan's movements, his interactions with other people, his attempts to create space between them. When they were alone, Lucas would linger longer than necessary, finding excuses to be near him, to touch him, even in the smallest of ways. He began to crave these moments of closeness, no matter how fleeting. They became his lifeline, a way to reassure himself that Ryan hadn't completely slipped away. But as Ryan's avoidance grew more pronounced, Lucas's frustration morphed into something darker. He became possessive, no longer content with the easygoing affection they had once shared. Instead, he began to demand more time, more attention, more of Ryan's presence. Lucas wanted to be the center of Ryan's world, just as Ryan had become the center of his. He couldn't stand the thought of Ryan turning to anyone else for comfort or friendship. If Ryan laughed with someone else, if he spent time with friends at school, or made plans that didn't include Lucas, it felt like a betrayal. Lucas's need for control intensified. He began to seek out moments when they were alone, away from prying eyes, where he could force the intimacy that Ryan was trying to avoid. In these moments, Lucas's touches lingered too long, his gaze was too intense, and his presence felt suffocating. He justified his actions by telling himself that he was protecting Ryan, that no one else could understand him the way he did. To Lucas, their relationship had become something sacred, something that needed to be guarded from the outside world. But for Ryan, Lucas's growing possessiveness felt like a trap. The safety and comfort he had once found in Lucas's company now turned into something suffocating, something from which he couldn't escape. Every time Lucas drew closer, Ryan felt the walls closing in around him. He was caught between the love he had once cherished and the fear that their bond had become twisted into something dangerous. Ryan's guilt gnawed at him. He still cared for Lucas, but the intensity of Lucas's obsession was overwhelming. What had once been brotherly love had now transformed into something far more complicated, and Ryan didn't know how to handle it. The once simple bond they had shared was now fraught with tension. Lucas's inability to let go, to allow Ryan the space he so desperately needed, created a rift between them. Lucas's obsession grew more demanding with each passing day, and Ryan could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. The more Lucas pushed, the more Ryan recoiled, and the cycle of tension and distance became unbearable. Lucas's possessiveness, once subtle, now became overt. He began to control Ryan's movements, questioning where he went, who he was with, and why he needed to be away from the house. Lucas's jealousy was no longer hidden, it simmered just beneath the surface, coloring every interaction between them. When Ryan spent time with friends, Lucas would find ways to intrude, to remind him of their bond, of the connection that Lucas believed only they could share. But this wasn't love anymore, not the kind of love that Ryan had once known. It had become something toxic, something obsessive, and it terrified him. Lucas's inability to let go, his growing need to control Ryan's every move, made it clear that their relationship had spiraled far beyond the realm of brotherhood. Lucas no longer saw Ryan as his stepbrother, but as something more, someone he believed he had the right to possess. The intensity of Lucas's feelings, once a source of comfort, had become suffocating, and Ryan could feel himself slipping further away under the weight of it. Ryan's attempts to distance himself only fueled Lucas's obsession. No matter how hard Ryan tried to pull away, Lucas found ways to pull him back in. Ryan couldn't escape the possessiveness that clung to him like a shadow, following him everywhere he went. Lucas was always there, watching, waiting, demanding his attention. The love that had once bound them together had turned into a prison, and Ryan didn't know how to break free. As Lucas's obsession deepened, it became clear that there was no going back to the way things had been. The bond that had once been their greatest strength was now their greatest weakness, and Lucas's love had become a destructive force, threatening to consume them both. As the tension between Lucas and Ryan escalated, the atmosphere between them became increasingly volatile. What had once been an unspoken tension had now evolved into something far more dangerous, simmering just beneath the surface of their daily lives. The closeness they once shared had become a battleground, with Lucas's obsession growing stronger and Ryan's desperation to escape deepening with every interaction. Their lives, which had once moved in harmony, were now filled with unspoken conflict, each day a test of who would break first under the mounting pressure. Lucas, consumed by his need to keep Ryan close, grew more controlling by the day. His frustration at Ryan's withdrawal transformed into anger. Though he did his best to hide it, the more distant Ryan became, the more determined Lucas was to hold on. He began watching Ryan's every move with an intensity that bordered on paranoia, scrutinizing even the smallest details: how Ryan avoided his gaze, how he would flinch when Lucas tried to touch him, how he found excuses to leave the house more often. Each sign of Ryan pulling away only served to ignite Lucas's fury, though he masked it with forced casualness, pretending nothing was wrong. In private, Lucas became increasingly insistent, pushing for the closeness they once had, but it no longer came from a place of affection. It was a need to dominate, to control the situation and force Ryan back into the bond they had shared before everything changed. The way Lucas touched Ryan now felt different. His hand would linger too long on Ryan's shoulder, his gaze too intense, his presence too overpowering. Lucas was no longer satisfied with subtle closeness. He wanted full control over Ryan, over their relationship, over everything that connected them. For Ryan, the tension was unbearable. He had once sought solace in Lucas, but now Lucas's presence felt like a trap he couldn't escape. Every time Lucas tried to force the intimacy that Ryan had grown so uncomfortable with, it felt as though a vice was tightening around his chest. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt claustrophobic. Ryan found himself constantly seeking refuge outside at school, with friends, anywhere that offered distance from Lucas's overbearing gaze. The possessiveness Lucas displayed wasn't limited to their moments alone. Even in public, among friends and family, Lucas began asserting subtle control over Ryan. At family gatherings, Lucas would position himself beside Ryan, ensuring they were always seen as a unit, inseparable, as they had been before. In social settings, Lucas would grow irritated if Ryan spoke to anyone for too long, especially when it came to Ryan's friendships with girls. Lucas's jealousy flared whenever Ryan seemed too comfortable with anyone else, and he would find ways to interrupt, drawing Ryan back to his side, cloaking his control in playful teasing or friendly banter. But beneath the surface, it was anything but playful. Lucas's need to dominate Ryan's attention became increasingly obvious, even to their friends, though no one said anything aloud. To the outside world, they were still stepbrothers who had grown unusually close, their bond seemingly unbreakable. But those closest to them began to notice the cracks forming: Ryan's unease, Lucas's intensity, and the strange tension that seemed to follow them wherever they went. The turning point came one evening when the family hosted a gathering at their house. Surrounded by relatives and friends, Ryan attempted to lose himself in the crowd, laughing and chatting with people, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy. For a brief moment, he felt like things could return to the way they once were, that perhaps he could escape the suffocating grip Lucas had on him, even if only for a few hours. But Lucas was always watching, his eyes tracking Ryan across the room. When Ryan began speaking to a girl from school, someone he had known casually for years, Lucas's jealousy flared like never before. To Lucas, the sight of Ryan laughing with someone else, especially someone outside their tight bond, was unbearable. It wasn't just that Ryan was smiling with someone else, it was that he seemed genuinely happy, free in a way he hadn't been around Lucas in weeks. Lucas could feel the anger rising inside him, a slow burn that threatened to erupt. He watched as Ryan and the girl talked, their conversation easy and natural, a stark contrast to the tense, suffocating dynamic that had developed between him and Ryan. The longer the interaction went on, the more Lucas's resentment grew. He tried to control it, forcing a smile as he made his way over to them, but the rage seethed beneath his calm exterior. When he finally reached Ryan, his presence cast a shadow over the light-hearted conversation. Lucas inserted himself into the interaction, his tone casual, but his eyes betrayed him. Ryan sensed the change, immediately the shift in Lucas's energy, the barely restrained anger simmering just beneath the surface. Lucas's body language was tense, his words sharp, though veiled in a thin layer of charm. The girl, sensing the tension, excused herself, leaving Lucas and Ryan standing alone. For Ryan, the moment felt like the final straw. The suffocation, the constant surveillance, the possessiveness, it had all become too much. He could no longer deny the fact that Lucas's love had turned into something dangerous, something controlling, and it terrified him. As the evening wore on, the tension between them continued to build, heavy and oppressive, until it became clear that something had irrevocably shifted between them. Later that night, back in their shared bedroom, the storm that had been brewing for weeks finally broke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but the anger was palpable. Ryan, exhausted from the constant pressure, could no longer keep pretending that everything was fine. He tried to avoid Lucas, retreating to his desk, his back turned in a futile attempt to gain some distance. But Lucas wasn't going to let him escape. Lucas's need for control, his inability to handle the idea of losing Ryan, had reached a breaking point. His emotions, once protective and brotherly, had twisted into something darker, more volatile. He could feel Ryan slipping away, and he refused to let that happen. The silence in the room was suffocating, filled with the weight of all that had gone unsaid, but neither of them could ignore it any longer. Ryan's heart raced as he sensed Lucas's anger building behind him. He could feel the heat of Lucas's gaze on his back, the unspoken demand for attention, for submission to the bond that Lucas had been clinging to for so long. But Ryan was done. The weight of Lucas's obsession had become too heavy, and Ryan knew that if he didn't break free now, he might never be able to. The escalation was inevitable. The tension that had been simmering between them for so long finally exploded, and there was no going back. Lucas's obsession had consumed him, and Ryan, desperate to escape, could no longer bear the pressure of being the object of that fixation. As the argument that had been brewing for weeks finally erupted, it became clear that their relationship had spiraled into something far beyond repair. The breaking point between Lucas and Ryan was inevitable, a collision that had been building from the moment their bond shifted from brotherhood to something darker. For weeks, their relationship had been spiraling out of control, the tension thickening with every glance, every touch, and every interaction. Lucas's possessiveness had grown into an obsession, while Ryan's increasing need to escape had turned into a desperate, silent battle. Their lives were now a tightrope, stretched so thin that it could snap at any moment, and it finally did. It happened one evening after yet another argument. Ryan had been out with friends, trying to carve out a space in his life where Lucas's presence didn't overshadow everything. He had spent the night laughing, feeling, for the first time in a long time, a sense of normalcy away from Lucas's constant watchfulness. But when he returned home, Lucas was waiting, his face set in a cold, unreadable mask. Ryan barely had time to close the door behind him before Lucas confronted him, demanding to know where he had been, who he had been with, and why he hadn't answered his calls or texts. The intensity in Lucas's voice was sharper than ever, layered with accusation and jealousy. Ryan could feel the exhaustion settling into his bones as Lucas's questions came at him like rapid fire. The constant surveillance, the possessiveness, the suffocating control, it had all become too much. He was trapped in a cycle of Lucas's obsession, and no matter how hard he tried to break free, Lucas always found a way to pull him back. That night, as he stood there in the hallway, feeling Lucas's presence like a weight on his chest, Ryan knew that he couldn't keep living like this. He was tired of the arguments, the intensity, and the endless pressure to stay in a relationship that had become toxic beyond repair. Lucas's anger simmered just beneath the surface, barely controlled. His eyes burned with a mixture of hurt and fury as he paced in front of Ryan, his words growing sharper with each passing second. He couldn't understand why Ryan had been avoiding him, why the closeness they had once shared had dissolved into this unbearable distance. In Lucas's mind, they were meant to be together. No one else could understand Ryan the way he did, and the thought of losing him drove Lucas into a frenzy. Every moment Ryan spent with someone else felt like a betrayal, a threat to the bond Lucas had worked so hard to preserve. But for Ryan, there was no bond left, only chains. Every time Lucas demanded more of him, Ryan felt those chains tighten, pulling him deeper into a suffocating space where he could barely breathe. That night, as Lucas's accusations grew more intense, Ryan's patience finally broke. He tried to explain, his voice shaking with exhaustion, that he needed space, that their relationship had become unbearable. But Lucas wasn't listening. He couldn't hear anything beyond his own fear of losing Ryan, and that fear twisted into something dangerous. As the argument escalated, Lucas's possessiveness became a physical presence. He stepped closer, invading Ryan's space, his body language a clear threat. Lucas had always been protective, but now his protection had turned into domination. Ryan, trapped in the hallway with Lucas towering over him, could feel the tension in the air crackling like electricity. He knew he had to end this, to break free from Lucas's grip once and for all, but he didn't know how. Every time he tried to pull away, Lucas tightened his hold, both emotionally and physically. The tipping point came when Ryan, his voice breaking under the pressure, told Lucas he couldn't do this anymore. He needed out of the house, out of their relationship, out of the suffocating control Lucas had placed on him. He wanted to escape, to find a life where Lucas wasn't always there, looming over every decision, every friendship, every aspect of his world. But Lucas couldn't accept that. To him, Ryan leaving wasn't just the end of their relationship, it was the end of everything. Ryan wasn't just a stepbrother to Lucas, he had become Lucas's entire world, the only thing keeping him anchored. Without Ryan, Lucas was lost, and that fear made him reckless. Lucas's response to Ryan's plea for space was immediate and violent. In a flash of rage, he grabbed Ryan's wrist, pulling him back with a force that took Ryan by surprise. The suddenness of Lucas's grip, the raw strength behind it, made Ryan's heart race with panic. He struggled, trying to free himself, but Lucas was too strong, his desperation fueling his grip. Ryan's mind raced as he realized how far Lucas had fallen into his obsession, how dangerous their relationship had become. For Lucas, this moment was everything. He couldn't let Ryan leave, he wouldn't survive it. His grip tightened as he begged, pleaded, and demanded that Ryan stay, his voice shaking with the intensity of his emotions. But for Ryan, there was no going back. He had already made his decision, he couldn't live like this anymore. The love he had once felt for Lucas had turned into fear. And now, with Lucas's hand gripping his arm so tightly it hurt, that fear turned into pure panic. Ryan's struggle to break free only made Lucas more desperate. The intensity of the moment spiraled out of control, the tension snapping like a rubber band pulled too tight for too long. In his desperation, Lucas shoved Ryan, the force of the push sending him stumbling backward. Ryan's body hit the edge of a table with a sickening thud, the sharp pain radiating through his back as he collapsed to the floor. Time seemed to slow as Ryan lay there, gasping for breath, his vision blurring with the shock of what had just happened. Lucas, frozen in place, stared down at Ryan in horror. The reality of his actions hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him with a force he hadn't anticipated. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The stepbrother he had loved, obsessed over, and controlled for so long now lay injured on the floor, the weight of Lucas's obsession crushing everything between them. The silence that followed was deafening, the tension broken, but at a cost neither of them had expected. For Ryan, this was the breaking point both physically and emotionally. As he lay there, pain shooting through his body, he realized there was no going back. Lucas's obsession had finally destroyed the bond they once shared, and there was nothing left to salvage. He knew with a sinking certainty that he had to leave, to escape before Lucas's control consumed him entirely. But in that moment, with Lucas standing over him, his face contorted in shock and regret, Ryan knew that nothing about their lives would ever be the same again. The events of that night left both Lucas and Ryan irreparably broken, their once inseparable bond shattered in the aftermath of Lucas's violent outburst. Ryan, physically hurt and emotionally drained, pulled himself off the floor with trembling hands, the pain of the impact still radiating through his body. His chest ached, not just from the fall, but from the suffocating weight of what had just happened, what their relationship had become. The person he had once looked to for protection, for guidance, had now become a danger, someone he needed to escape from. But the real tragedy was not just in that moment of violence, but in the long, slow unraveling of everything they had built together. Ryan left the house that night. He didn't look back as he walked out the door, limping slightly from the injury, but driven by the need to put distance between himself and Lucas. His mind raced as he tried to process the reality of his situation. He had lost not just a stepbrother, but the one person he had trusted more than anyone. The love he had once felt, complicated and messy as it had been, had now dissolved into something unrecognizable. All that was left was fear of Lucas's control, fear of the obsession that had grown like a poison between them, and fear of what Lucas might do next. Lucas, left alone in the house, stood frozen in the empty hallway. His hands shook as he replayed the moment over and over in his mind, the feel of Ryan's wrist in his grip, the shock on Ryan's face, the sound of his body hitting the table. He had hurt Ryan, physically yes, but more than that, he had crossed a line he could never uncross. The person he loved most in the world, the one person he believed he couldn't live without, had walked out of his life, possibly for good. And it was his fault. The reality of his obsession, of how far he had fallen into it, came crashing down on him with suffocating weight. In the days that followed, Lucas descended into a state of deep despair. He stopped going to school, isolating himself from friends and family. He couldn't bear to face anyone, not with the guilt eating away at him. His phone remained silent, no messages from Ryan, no calls to give him hope that maybe, somehow, things could be repaired. Lucas had lost control not just of Ryan, but of everything. He was adrift, drowning in the consequences of his actions, unable to see a way out. Every attempt to reach out to Ryan was met with silence, and that silence was deafening. For Ryan, the days after the incident were filled with confusion and emotional turmoil. He stayed with friends, avoiding his family, avoiding the questions that would inevitably come. How could he explain what had happened without exposing the dark, twisted reality of his relationship with Lucas? How could he make anyone understand the suffocating control, the possessiveness that had driven Lucas to hurt him? Ryan felt trapped not just by what Lucas had done, but by the secrecy of it all. He couldn't bring himself to tell anyone the full truth, couldn't bear the thought of revealing how far things had gone. But while Ryan tried to rebuild his life, Lucas's obsession deepened into something far more dangerous. He couldn't accept the loss of Ryan. In his mind, they were still connected, still bound by the love they had once shared, no matter how twisted that love had become. Lucas began to convince himself that if he could just see Ryan again, if they could just talk, everything would go back to the way it had been. He clung to this delusion, using it as a lifeline in the sea of guilt and despair that had engulfed him. The breaking point came one night when Lucas, in a fit of desperation, decided to confront Ryan directly. He couldn't stand the silence any longer, couldn't stand the idea that Ryan might never return. His thoughts spiraled into dark places, his obsession clouding any sense of reason or rationality. Lucas drove to the house where Ryan had been staying with friends, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. In his mind, this confrontation was necessary. He had to make Ryan understand that they belonged together, that no one else could ever take his place. Ryan had been trying to move on, but he hadn't been able to shake the feeling that Lucas was still watching him, still waiting in the background. That night, when Lucas arrived unannounced, barging through the front door, Ryan's heart sank with a familiar dread. The look in Lucas's eyes was one Ryan had never seen before, wild, desperate, dangerous. Lucas demanded to talk, to make things right, but there was no reasoning with him. His words were filled with desperation, fueled by the belief that Ryan was still his, that they were meant to be together no matter what. As Ryan tried to reason with him, to calm him down, Lucas's emotions boiled over. His obsession, which had once been hidden beneath layers of brotherly affection, now spilled out into full-blown fury. He couldn't understand why Ryan was pulling away, why he was rejecting the love Lucas still clung to. And in that moment, Lucas snapped. The confrontation escalated into a physical struggle, just like the one that had broken them before. But this time, the stakes were much higher. In the chaos, something went terribly wrong. Whether it was an accident or the result of Lucas's uncontrolled rage, Ryan was fatally injured. The struggle ended in tragedy, with Ryan's body lying motionless on the floor, blood pooling around him. Lucas, in shock, stared down at what he had done, the reality of his actions sinking in like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He had destroyed the one person he loved most, the person he had sworn to protect, all because his obsession had consumed him entirely. For a brief moment, Lucas knelt beside Ryan, his hands trembling as he tried to comprehend the enormity of what had just happened. The house was eerily silent, the aftermath of violence hanging heavy in the air. Tears streamed down Lucas's face as he cradled Ryan's lifeless body, whispering apologies that came too late. The magnitude of his loss hit him like a tidal wave, drowning him in guilt and despair. He had crossed the final line, and there was no going back. Unable to live with the weight of what he had done, Lucas made the final decision to end his own life. In his mind, there was no future without Ryan, no way to exist in a world where he had destroyed the person he loved. In the darkness of that night, Lucas took his own life, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would haunt their families forever. The deaths of Lucas and Ryan shocked everyone who knew them. Friends, family, and the community struggled to make sense of how two stepbrothers, once so close, could fall into such a dark, tragic place. The love that had once bound them had become twisted, turning into an obsession that led to their mutual destruction. Their story, once filled with promise and affection, had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how unchecked emotions, secrecy, and possessiveness can spiral into something deadly. The town mourned, but no one could truly understand the depths of what had happened behind closed doors, or the tragic end of a love that had gone so terribly wrong.